There are betrayals that feel sudden, like a door slammed in your face, and then there are betrayals that unfold slowly, smiling at you the entire time. Mine belong to the second kind. The kind that sits beside you on your own couch, drinks from your glasses, laughs at your memories, and memorizes your life so thoroughly that it knows exactly where to cut. The night I realized my best friend wasn't just visiting my marriage, but actively living inside it, I didn't gasp or scream. I felt something far colder and far more dangerous settle into my chest. Certainty. The kind that tells you this isn't a misunderstanding, this isn't loneliness, and this isn't something that can be fixed with conversation. It's a choice, a deliberate one. And once I saw that clearly, I stopped reacting like a betrayed wife and started thinking like a woman who finally understood how deeply she had been underestimated. My name is Judith Warren. I am 61 years old and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Madison, Wisconsin, where people wave politely and assume they know your story just by looking at your house. I was married for 36 years to a man everyone described as dependable, and I had a best friend, Carol, who had been part of my life for even longer. She knew everything. My routines, my fears, my habits. She had comforted me through losses, celebrated my milestones, and sat at my table more times than I could count. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Your city or state? Leave it in the comments, because stories like mine don't belong to one woman or one place. They happen quietly across America, in homes that look perfectly ordinary from the outside. I didn't suspect betrayal because there were no obvious cracks. My husband didn't grow distant overnight. My best friend didn't disappear. They grew comfortable. And comfort is where the most calculated betrayals are born. They believed I was too loyal, too trusting, too settled to ever notice. What they never considered was that I had spent a lifetime watching people closely, and that once I started paying attention, I never missed a thing. Once that awareness settled in, everything around me sharpened. Conversations that once felt harmless suddenly carried weight. Carol began finishing my husband's sentences, not in the way close friends sometimes do, but with the confidence of someone who had heard those thoughts expressed privately. She knew when he'd be late before he mentioned it. She joked about his preferences as if they were shared knowledge, not something I had spent decades learning. And my husband, he stopped correcting her. That was the part that mattered most. Silence is a powerful confession when it appears in the wrong place. I didn't accuse them. Accusations invite denial, and denial would have only taught them to be more careful. Instead, I watched. I watched how their phones were always nearby, how their laughter softened when I entered a room, how their plans increasingly excluded me without ever saying so out loud. What hurt wasn't jealousy. At my age, you understand that desire fades and shifts. What hurt was the entitlement, the assumption that my role was to make space for their happiness while swallowing my own. I had become infrastructure, useful, dependable, invisible, and yet they still relied on me for financial stability, for social credibility, for the life I had built and maintained while they planned their escape. That realization didn't break me, it steadied me. Because once you understand someone is using your silence as permission, you also understand the leverage you still hold. I began to move quietly, not out of fear, but discipline. I reviewed accounts. I revisited agreements. I remembered conversations I had dismissed years earlier as harmless jokes, and with every small observation, my certainty grew. This wasn't an affair born of weakness. It was a coordinated betrayal, and coordination always leaves a trail. The confirmation came in a way so ordinary it almost felt insulting. One afternoon, Carol showed up at my house unannounced, something she had done countless times before, but this time there was a shift in her confidence that didn't belong to a guest. She moved through the space as if it already recognized her, opening cabinets without asking, commenting on changes I had made, sitting in my chair at the kitchen table without hesitation. She spoke about my husband's stress at work with a familiarity that went beyond friendship, and when she mentioned a weekend trip he had never told me about, she froze for half a second too long. That pause told me everything. I didn't correct her. I didn't react. I let her talk. People always reveal the truth when they believe it's already been accepted. Later that evening, when my husband came home, I watched the choreography between them unfold with painful clarity. A glance held just a moment longer than necessary. A shared understanding disguised as politeness. A tension that existed not because they were hiding something, but because they were growing careless. I excused myself early that night, not overwhelmed, but resolved. Standing alone in my bedroom, I realized the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was logistical. They weren't sneaking moments. They were building a future that assumed my quiet exit. And in that realization, something hardened inside me, not into bitterness, but into focus. Because if they were planning my disappearance, then I would decide the terms of it. From that moment on, I stopped living inside the story they were telling themselves and began living inside the truth they were trying to hide. Detachment is a strange gift. It removes the fog without dulling the senses. I no longer asked my husband how his day was, not because I didn't care, but because I already knew the answers would be curated. I no longer confided in Carol, because trust, once exposed as a weapon, can never be handled casually again. Instead, I listened. I paid attention to language, to timing, to the way plans were discussed around me as if I were already a complication rather than a person. Slowly, painfully, the shape of their intention became clear. They weren't just betraying me emotionally. They were positioning themselves financially and socially, preparing for a transition they believed would be smooth and uncontested. They assumed I would grieve quietly, accept whatever narrative they offered, and step aside with grace. What they didn't understand was that grace does not mean surrender. I began organizing my affairs the way I had organized my household for decades, methodically, thoroughly, without announcement. I revisited documents I had signed years ago when love still felt like protection. I consulted professionals under the guise of future planning, asking careful questions framed as curiosity rather than suspicion. And with every answer, every clause explained. My footing grew firmer. There is a moment in every betrayal when the balance of power shifts, not when the truth is revealed, but when the betrayed person knows more than the betrayers. That moment belongs only to the one who waits. And by the time Carol began speaking openly about new beginnings, and my husband grew impatient with the routines that had once anchored him, I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. The announcement came the way all their decisions did, carefully framed to sound reasonable. My husband sat across from me at the dining table one evening, his hands folded as if he were delivering bad news he had already made peace with. He told me he wanted a divorce, that it had been a long time coming, that he hoped we could handle it like adults. His voice carried that familiar tone of calm authority, the one he used when he believed the outcome was already decided. He said there was someone else, and when he finally said Carol's name, he waited for a reaction he never got. I nodded. I asked practical questions. I thanked him for being honest. I told him I wanted things to remain civil. I watched relief wash over his face, and in that moment I understood exactly how he saw me, not as a woman capable of response, but as a system he could shut down politely. Within weeks, their plans accelerated. Carol stopped pretending. She spoke openly about love, about destiny, about how sometimes happiness hurts people. She didn't say my name when she said it, but she didn't have to. They told friends their story before I told anyone mine, painting themselves as brave, honest, finally free. And I let them, because while they were busy managing perception, I was finalizing protections. While they discussed venues and guest lists, I was closing accounts, activating clauses, and ensuring that nothing they believed was theirs rested on assumptions anymore. They mistook my composure for compliance. They mistook my silence for permission. And by the time invitations were sent and congratulations poured in, the foundation they planned to build on had already been quietly removed. I let the wedding plans move forward without interference, and that decision confused people later when they learned the full story. They assumed restraint meant weakness, that allowing the celebration to happen was some kind of emotional surrender. But what they didn't understand was that timing matters more than reaction. I signed the divorce papers exactly when advised, without argument, without protest, without demanding anything beyond what was already protected. I wished them well with a calm that made my husband uncomfortable, even if he didn't yet know why. Carol hugged me once afterward, her arms tight, her voice trembling as she whispered something about hoping I'd find happiness too. I smiled and thanked her, noticing how much reassurance she needed from the very person she believed she had replaced. That moment told me everything I needed to know. Confidence doesn't seek approval. Guilt does. As they moved toward their new life, reality began to reveal itself in quiet, unavoidable ways. Certain assets didn't transfer as expected. Obligations followed names they hadn't planned on carrying. Financial responsibilities appeared where comfort had been assumed. My husband called me once, carefully casual, asking if I knew why some accounts required additional authorization. I told him I wasn't sure and suggested he speak to his attorney. Carol sent messages instead, polite at first, then increasingly strained, asking if there had been a mistake. I replied kindly, briefly, never explaining, because the truth didn't need my voice anymore. It was written into agreements they had never bothered to read, protections they assumed didn't matter because they never imagined I would use them. While they focused on romance and appearances, I had focused on permanence. And permanence, unlike passion, does not bend when ignored. The unraveling didn't announce itself with drama. It never does when it's rooted in paperwork, obligations, and reality. It arrived quietly, in delays and denials, in phone calls that ended with forced politeness and unanswered questions. Mutual friends began to notice tension beneath the surface of their carefully presented happiness. The smiles in photos grew tighter. The enthusiasm in their voices dulled. Carol, who once moved with certainty, began asking cautious questions through others. Questions about finances, about timing, about things she thought should have already been settled. My former husband, once so confident in his ability to manage any situation, grew short-tempered and distracted. He wasn't used to systems that didn't respond to charm, and he wasn't used to me being absent from the role of problem solver. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a steady sense of inevitability. Consequences don't need witnesses, they just need time. What struck me most was how quickly they turned inward once things stopped working smoothly. Their shared narrative of love and destiny couldn't carry the weight of responsibility they had underestimated. Romance had been easy when it lived on stolen time and borrowed stability. Building a life, however, requires endurance, accountability, and a willingness to face discomfort without blaming someone else. I heard through quiet channels that arguments had become frequent, that stress had replaced excitement, that blame had begun to circulate. And in those moments, I understood something clearly. Their relationship had been fueled by what they took from me, my silence, my labor, my stability. Without that foundation, they were left to face each other without insulation. And I was no longer there to absorb the impact. By the time the cracks became visible to the outside world, I had already rebuilt most of my inner life. That part rarely gets acknowledged, the quiet work of recovery that happens long before anyone else notices. I had learned how to sit with unanswered questions without chasing explanations. I learned how to walk past places that once held memories without feeling the need to stop. Most importantly, I learned how to let go of the illusion that closure comes from confrontation. Closure came when I stopped expecting decency from people who had already shown me who they were. While they were busy negotiating blame and justifying choices, I was reclaiming routines, mornings, and a sense of self that had been postponed for years. And then something unexpected happened. People started reaching out to me, not with gossip, not with pity, but with curiosity. They wanted to know how I was so calm, how I seemed untouched by the chaos that was quietly circling my former life. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Strength doesn't announce itself, it shows up in consistency. I was no longer reacting, I was choosing. And that difference changed how the world responded to me. Opportunities surfaced. Conversations shifted. I was seen not as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had survived with dignity intact. Meanwhile, the noise behind me grew louder, more frantic, as unresolved choices demanded attention. I didn't turn back. I had already moved on, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The truth has a way of surfacing when people least expect it, and when it did, it wasn't through my voice or my actions. It came through patterns that could no longer be hidden. Stories didn't align. Timelines contradicted each other. Small lies collided with bigger ones, and suddenly the narrative they had worked so hard to control began unraveling on its own. Friends who once avoided eye contact started asking careful questions. Colleagues noticed inconsistencies. Even family members, those who had chosen silence over honesty, could no longer ignore what was obvious. And through it all, I remained absent from the drama, which only made the contrast sharper. That absence became its own statement. I didn't defend myself because I no longer needed to. I didn't expose anyone because the truth was doing a far better job without my involvement. What people saw was not revenge in the loud, cinematic sense, but consequence. Real, slow, unavoidable consequence. While they scrambled to explain themselves, I was building something new, something stable, something rooted in peace instead of survival. That was the part no one expected. That walking away with grace could be more powerful than staying to fight. I hadn't won because they lost. I had won because I refused to keep living in a story that required my silence to function. In the end, the victory didn't look like applause or apologies. It looked like distance. It looked like waking up without dread, without rehearsing conversations in my head, without wondering who was lying to me that day. It looked like clarity. I finally understood that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from people who benefit from your patience, your silence, your loyalty. And revenge, real revenge, isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's becoming so grounded, so self-directed, that the people who once controlled the narrative no longer recognize their place in it. I didn't need closure from them because I gave it to myself. I chose peace over proving a point, growth over bitterness, and dignity over chaos. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been underestimated, used, or quietly pushed aside while being told to be understanding, know this: your restraint is not weakness, and your silence is not consent. You are allowed to step away. You are allowed to rewrite the ending. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living a life that no longer requires their permission. If you've experienced something similar, share your thoughts. Your story might be the reminder someone else needs today. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something you've lived through, don't stay silent. Share your experience in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think, and someone reading it may feel less alone because of you. Like this story, if you believe self-respect is the strongest form of revenge. Subscribe for more real, emotionally powerful betrayal and comeback stories that reflect the strength of everyday women. And remember, don't underestimate the power of women.